Was one of the largest human trafficking events in the United States, really, of our lifetime. Of those 500,000 children, more than 90,000 were sent to sponsors or who were unvetted, essentially, unvetted sponsors, or to homes where no home study was conducted. In other words, and I saw this, where 10 children would go to one house as a sponsor of the 10 children. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to know what's going on here. It was a perfect storm for child sex trafficking. And now, unfortunately, it is occurring. Mr. Thompson, I think in your role, you're best equipped to give us a sort of a prognosis of this problem. And how do you see their vulnerability going into these FIFA World Cup games?
You just watched a chilling performance where a man testified that the Biden administration essentially created the conditions for one of the largest human trafficking crises in American history. And let me tell you before we even begin, where the foundations of this lie, and where the rage must be directed, we need to understand that what you're watching is not accidental incompetence, but the deliberate weaponization of human suffering for political gain. And the ghoulish irony is that the very people making these accusations are the architects of actual documented child separation policies that traumatized thousands of children as state policy. But immigration experts tell CBS News these claims are misleading and misrepresent government data, and yet here we are watching Republicans perform outrage theater while the facts tell a very different story about what's actually happening to migrant children in this country and who bears responsibility for the systems that fail them. And we need to pull apart this performance piece by piece, because embedded within this rhetoric is a dangerous distortion campaign designed to obscure Republican obstruction of actual border solutions, while simultaneously resurrecting some of the darkest nativist conspiracy theories that have fueled violence in American history. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers matter, and Republicans know that if they can throw around big scary figures without context, they can manufacture moral panic. And you heard him say 500,000 children and 90,000 placed with unvetted sponsors, and 10 children to one house, and he's painting this picture of industrial-scale trafficking. But here's what's actually true according to the data. 32,000 UACs did not appear for court hearings between FY 2019-23, and 29,000 UACs who were not issued NTAs as of May 2024, a total of 323,000 individuals, and Republicans began making claims that more than 300,000 unaccompanied children had been lost after the Department of Homeland Security released a report in August, which showed that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, did not serve notices to appear in court to 291,000 children between fiscal year 2019 and May 2024. Notice something about that time frame? Around half of this period occurred when Trump was president. The report did not specify the number of children who missed court appearances under each administration. So immediately the framing collapses, because this isn't a Biden crisis. It's a systemic issue that spans administrations, and the characterization of these children as lost or missing is itself a manipulation, because the report did not find that the children were effectively lost, victims of sex trafficking, or being used as drug mules. What does it actually mean when we say ICE didn't serve notices to appear, or children missed court dates? It means bureaucratic failures of coordination between agencies. It means families moved and addresses weren't updated. It means these minors could miss court for numerous reasons, including that they did not receive their notice to appear because ICE did not have their correct address on file. Sometimes there are communication failures between ICE and other government agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services, and critically, it does not mean that the child's in an unsafe place. It means someone didn't answer the phone when the Office of Refugee Resettlement conducted follow-up calls. This is not a trafficking pipeline. This is administrative dysfunction that needs fixing, but Republicans have zero interest in fixing it, because chaos serves their narrative, and Donald Trump explicitly told them to keep the border in chaos because it helps him politically, and we have the receipts on that. Let's talk about what Republicans actually did when they had the chance to address border security and child safety, because this is where the moral obscenity becomes crystal clear. Because Republicans do not want to fix the border, Republicans said that fixing the border was their top priority. They appointed a hardline conservative, my friend Senator James Lankford, to come up with a bipartisan bill to fix the border. They said if Lankford can get the deal, they'd support it. We got that deal. If it passed, it would have been the toughest border security bill in our lifetime. The bill included $20 billion for border security, more detention beds, more patrol officers, more asylum officers, more equipment to intercept fentanyl, and new emergency powers to close parts of the border when crossings exceeded capacity. And what did Republicans do? Within hours of the bill's release, Republicans killed it. When it came to the floor, only 4 Republicans voted for the bill they asked for. Why? Because Donald Trump, who says he wants chaos to continue at the border, because that will help him politically, told them to tank it, and they obeyed like the servile apparatchiks they've become. So when you see a Republican congressman testifying about the horror of unvetted sponsors and children disappearing into trafficking, understand that this is projection at its most brazen, because Republicans blocking the bill would make the border less secure. I think it makes our border less secure, but it's also a terrible political decision by Republicans, because this country will see it for what it is, a decision to keep the country unsafe just because Donald Trump benefits from chaos. They are literally choosing to perpetuate the conditions they claim to be horrified by because electoral advantage matters more than children's safety, and this should be disqualifying, but we live in an era where Republican bad faith has been so normalized that even the most grotesque hypocrisy barely registers. Now let's address the elephant in the room that makes this entire performance so stomach-turning, because when Republicans talk about child welfare at the border, we need to remember what they actually did when they controlled policy. The family separation policy under the first Trump administration was a controversial immigration enforcement strategy implemented in the United States from 2017 to 2018, aimed at deterring illegal immigration by separating migrant children from their parents or guardians. This wasn't some accident of bureaucracy. This was deliberate cruelty as policy, and during the Trump administration, over 5,000 children were separated from their parents with no records that would enable parents and children to be reunited. Let that sink in. They intentionally tore children from their parents and didn't even bother to create a system to reunite them, and there are over 150 separated children whose parents, to this day, the U.S. government has not even located. This was state-sanctioned trauma. Medical experts describe family separation as akin to torture and state-sanctioned child abuse that will lead to lifelong mental, emotional, and physical damage, and it was championed by the same people now clutching their pearls about Biden's border policies. Trump demoted Daniel Ragsdale as director of ICE and replaced him with Thomas Homan, who had long advocated for the separation of children from their families as a means of deterring illegal immigration. The journalist Caitlin Dickerson described Homan as the intellectual father of child separation, and Stephen Miller, Trump's senior advisor and the white nationalist architect of these policies, said that not carrying out the family separation policy would mean the end of our country as we know it. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the man who implemented zero tolerance, delivered the infamous line, "We need to take away children." They said the quiet part out loud. The cruelty was the point, the trauma was intentional, because they thought terrorizing families would deter migration. And here's what makes it even more unconscionable. During the pilot program, the administration discovered that it was unable to track separated family members in a way that would facilitate eventual reunification. Knowing this, and without doing anything to address the tracking systems employed by federal agencies, the administration chose to expand the policy nationwide in May 2018. They knew they couldn't reunite families, and they did it anyway. They knew they were creating orphans, and they scaled up the operation, because cruelty was always the policy, not an unfortunate side effect. And now Tom Homan, the intellectual godfather of family separation, is Trump's incoming border czar, promising mass deportations, which is family separation by another name. It's not ripping away children from their parents at the border, but it is taking parents away from children in their homes and at their schools and in the interior of the country. So when Republicans perform this theater about Biden losing children, what they're actually doing is laundering their own sins through accusation, because that's how authoritarian movements operate. You accuse the opposition of the crimes you commit, you flood the zone with so much bad faith that truth becomes impossible to discern, and you mobilize your base through manufactured outrage about threats that you yourself created. And let's be absolutely clear about what's happening with the vetting process, because the Republican narrative suggests Biden just threw open the doors and handed children to traffickers without any safeguards whatsoever, and that's a malicious lie. While some unaccompanied minors have become victims of trafficking or other crimes, the government safely releases most of these children to vetted sponsors, often a family member, while their immigration cases play out. The office attempts to release children to sponsors, which can include parents, relatives, and guardians, and federal policy dictates that the government vet these sponsors via interviews or background checks. Now, did the Biden administration make changes to expedite releases? Yes, because over 500,000 unaccompanied minors crossed the southern border from 2021-2025 during an unprecedented humanitarian migration crisis driven by violence, climate catastrophe, and economic collapse in Central America, and these children cannot be held indefinitely in government facilities because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Flores v. Lynch that, pursuant to the Flores Settlement Agreement, both unaccompanied and accompanied minors could only be held in detention for a short time, roughly 20 days. So the system was overwhelmed and the Biden administration attempted to speed processing while maintaining safety protocols, but Grassley repeatedly warned that the Biden-Harris UAC program's inadequate safeguards, lax vetting procedures, and limited interagency communication allowed children to be lost or released to dangerous adult sponsors, and there were real failures here, failures that should be investigated and corrected. But here's the thing, the failures were failures of capacity and coordination in a system drowning in volume, not failures of malicious intent, and Republicans blocked every attempt to provide more resources. Instead of joining the Biden administration and members of both parties in the Senate to find common ground, Speaker Johnson is continuing to block President Biden's proposed funding to hire thousands of new Border Patrol agents, hire more asylum officers and immigration judges, provide local communities hosting migrants additional grant funding, and invest in cutting-edge technology that is critical to stopping deadly fentanyl from entering our country. They wanted the crisis, they needed the crisis, because without crisis, they have no campaign strategy and no way to mobilize their increasingly radicalized base around the nativist resentment that has become the beating heart of Republican politics. And we need to talk about what's embedded in this rhetoric, because when you hear Republicans describing this as one of the largest human trafficking events in American history, when you hear them talk about mysterious unvetted sponsors taking 10 children at a time, when you hear the implication that there's this coordinated pipeline delivering children to predators, what you're hearing is the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories that have inspired mass violence, rhetoric used by Republican office holders about the surge of migrants at the border with Mexico increasingly echoes the Great Replacement conspiracy theory that has inspired violence in the past and could do so again in the future. The Great Replacement theory, rooted in white nationalism, posits without basis that a powerful cabal of elites are deliberately replacing white Americans with immigrants, and another version, voiced by some high-ranking GOP officials, asserts that Democrats are intentionally bringing in immigrants to dilute the strength of Republican voters. This is blood and soil nationalism dressed up as child welfare concern, and it's dangerous not just because it distorts reality, but because it has already inspired terrorist attacks by white supremacists who believed they were defending their country from invasion. And when you combine that with Trump's dehumanizing rhetoric about undocumented immigrants poisoning the blood of our country, you have a combustible mixture of fascistic ideology and manufactured crisis that threatens not just immigrants, but the basic foundations of democratic governance and human rights. The language of invasion and trafficking, the implication of sinister forces deliberately flooding America with foreign children, the suggestion that Democrats are complicit in child abuse because it serves their political interests. This is not policy analysis. This is the kind of rhetoric that precedes pogroms. Now let's examine what's actually happening right now under the incoming Trump administration, because we're getting a preview of what Republican concern for child welfare actually looks like in practice. Government sources say that for the last 6 weeks they've been ordered not to release undocumented children who cross the U.S.-Mexico border alone to join their parents and relatives. The Trump administration has added these new vetting requirements for sponsors, like DNA testing for family members and fingerprinting all the adults in the household where the kid's going to be living. That has really slowed down the process over the last few months, but this virtual halt in releases is new. So Trump administration officials are essentially keeping children in detention indefinitely, creating exactly the kind of prolonged government custody that we know causes severe psychological harm, while simultaneously immigration rights groups believe that the family members or sponsors could be walking into a built-in opportunity to be arrested by federal immigration enforcement when they come forward to claim their children. Do you see what's happening here? They're using child welfare as a pretext for an immigration enforcement. They're creating a system where undocumented family members are terrified to come forward because doing so means potential deportation, which means more children languish in government facilities, which means more families stay separated, which is the point, because the goal was never child safety, the goal is deterrence through cruelty, the goal is making life so unbearable for migrants that they stop coming, and if children suffer in the process, well, that's acceptable, collateral damage in the war to preserve white Christian America from the demographic tide. This is not hyperbole, this is what the policy outcomes reveal when you look at them honestly. And here's where we need to talk about what progressive immigration policy would actually look like. Because it's not enough to simply point out Republican hypocrisy and obstruction. We need an affirmative vision rooted in human rights and the recognition that migration is a humanitarian crisis, requiring humanitarian solutions, not law enforcement solutions. We need to massively expand the capacity of the immigration court system so that cases can be processed in months, not years. We need to hire more asylum officers and provide robust legal representation for children in proceedings. We need comprehensive tracking systems that maintain family connections and enable real-time monitoring of child welfare. We need international cooperation to address the root causes of migration, the violence and instability and climate destruction that force people to flee their homes in the first place. We need pathways to legal status for people already here who are contributing to our communities and raising American children. And yes, we need robust vetting of sponsors with proper resources to conduct home studies and follow-up, but vetting designed to protect children, not vetting designed as a deportation trap. But none of this happens because Republicans don't want solutions. They want spectacle. They want to be able to point at the border and scream invasion. They want to activate the racial anxieties of white voters who see demographic change as existential threat. They want to position themselves as the defenders of innocent children against predatory foreigners, while simultaneously implementing policies that traumatize those very children because the narrative matters more than the reality and the cruelty is the point. For Republicans, the border is a money-making grievance machine. Republicans would lose their money-making grievance machine, the broken border, and that's why they killed the bipartisan border bill. That's why they blocked funding for asylum officers and immigration judges. That's why Tom Homan is promising mass deportations that will separate American citizen children from their undocumented parents in the millions. Let's also address the role of right-wing media and Republican officials in amplifying these claims, because after an August 2024 New York Post article citing the OIG report referred to the children as lost or missing, the Trump campaign and various elected officials repeated the claims numerous times, often erroneously asserting that the vast majority of the children were being exploited, despite the fact that there's no evidence to support that claim. They took bureaucratic failures to track court appearances and transformed them into a narrative of mass trafficking, because fear works, outrage works, and if you can convince people that Democrats are enabling child rape, then you can get away with virtually any policy, no matter how cruel, because you're fighting monsters and anything is justified in that fight. This is moral panic as political strategy, and it's been extraordinarily effective at mobilizing the Republican base, while simultaneously making rational border policy impossible, because how do you compromise with people who believe you're deliberately facilitating child trafficking? And we need to understand the context of the current Trump administration's approach, because Secretary Kristi Noem said, by leaving our borders open and even encouraging people to come here illegally, Biden enabled the largest human trafficking operation in modern history, while the Trump administration has located 13,000 of these children through welfare checks that have also resulted in special agents discovered sponsors in possession of child sexual abuse material, those who had forced minors into labor, and those who subjected them to living conditions that constituted neglect. So yes, there are real cases of abuse and exploitation happening, and those need to be investigated, prosecuted, but the question is whether those cases represent a systemic failure unique to Biden policies, or whether they represent the predictable outcome when you have 500,000 vulnerable children moving through an overwhelmed system, and the answer is clearly the latter, because the United States government placed an unknown number of Central American migrant children into the custody of human traffickers after neglecting to run the most basic checks on these so-called caregivers, New York Magazine reported in 2016, based on a Senate report about incidents during the Obama administration. This is not new. This is not unique to Biden. This is what happens when you have massive flows of unaccompanied minors and insufficient resources to properly vet and monitor placements, and the solution is more resources, better systems, stronger interagency coordination. And yes, sometimes that means slowing down releases to ensure safety, but it cannot mean indefinite detention, and it cannot mean using child welfare as a weapon of immigration enforcement, and it absolutely cannot mean blocking legislation that would provide the resources to actually fix these problems while simultaneously screaming about how broken everything is. That is bad faith at its most toxic, and we should call it what it is, which is political terrorism, using children as hostages to advance an authoritarian xenophobic agenda. Here's what should enrage us all: the manufactured nature of this crisis, and the deliberate Republican sabotage of solutions so they can campaign on chaos. Republicans believe that if they can make 2024 the year of the border, an issue that polls consistently show is a top priority for voters and a vulnerability for Democrats. President Biden will be defeated at the ballot box in November, and that calculation, that nakedly political calculation,
meant that they were willing to leave children vulnerable. They were willing to perpetuate trafficking risks. They were willing to keep the border in chaos because it served their electoral interests, and now they have the audacity to stand in congressional hearings and perform outrage about the consequences of the chaos they deliberately created and maintained. This should be disqualifying. This should end political careers, but instead it will probably help them win elections because we live in an information ecosystem so polluted with propaganda that truth struggles to penetrate. And what makes this all the more galling is that in the last 4 years, there were more than 65,000 reports of possible illegal acts ignored or dismissed, of which roughly 7,300 or 13% involved human trafficking, and from August 2023 to January of 2025, 65,000 calls went unanswered to the hotline where concerns about children could be reported. Those are real failures. Those represent children who may have been in danger while reports went uninvestigated, and that is unconscionable and people should be held accountable, but the context matters because
the IG report states that, as of September 2024, ICE has just over 1,000 staff to monitor over 7.5 million non-detained cases, which means the system was impossibly overwhelmed, and Republicans knew this and refused to provide resources and then pointed to the failures as evidence of democratic malfeasance. This is the politics of cruelty. This is the politics of bad faith. This is the politics that makes democracy unworkable, because you cannot govern when one party has decided that sabotage serves their interests better than solutions, and you cannot have rational policy debates when one side is trafficking in conspiracy theories and blood libel about their opponents enabling child rape. We are in a very dark place politically when this kind of rhetoric becomes normalized, and when we fail to recognize that what we're watching is not a good faith disagreement about border policy, but rather the deployment of fascistic propaganda techniques designed to dehumanize migrants, demonize Democrats, and justify escalating state violence against vulnerable populations. The path forward requires us to see this clearly, to name it accurately, and to demand better, because migrant children deserve better than to be used as political props by Republicans who don't actually care about their welfare, and who proved that definitively when they implemented family separation as official policy and then failed to track the children they traumatized. These children deserve a system with adequate resources, robust vetting, genuine child welfare expertise, and a recognition that they are human beings fleeing terrible circumstances, not invaders or pawns in a political game. They deserve legal representation. They deserve timely court proceedings. They deserve to be placed with family members when possible, and monitored carefully when that's not possible. And they deserve a political class that will prioritize their safety over electoral advantage, but that requires us to break the cycle of manufactured crisis and bad faith obstruction that Republicans have made the centerpiece of their border strategy. And until we do, until we force accountability for the Republican sabotage of border security, until we name the white nationalist conspiracy theories embedded in this rhetoric, until we remember that Trump and his allies literally separated thousands of children as official policy, we will keep watching these obscene performances where the architects of cruelty masquerade as champions of child welfare, and the victims of their policies continue to suffer in the shadows, while America argues about whose fault it is that children are being harmed by a system that both parties have failed, but that only one party has deliberately sabotaged for political gain.